She is Dr. Irasema Alcántara Ayala. She is former director and current professor of Institute of Geography at the of our university, UNAM. She studied her BA bachelor degree from UNAM in the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters. Later, she obtained a PhD in Geography Geomorphology from King's College London in the University of London. And she is having a postdoc from MIT in Boston. Her research interest is concentrated on landslides, integrated disaster risk research, and integrated disaster management. She has been in various committees and organizations. She has been former vice president of the International Geographical Union, like IGU, it's equivalent to AGU for geographers. She is now the vice president of the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Program of the International Science Council. Since last 20 years almost, she has been collaborating with the National Center for Disaster Prevention, that is NAPRED. So please welcome Dr. Irasema. She will be talking about understanding disaster risk and disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I would like to start by thanking Professor Roy for the kind invitation this morning to share some of the ideas about disaster risk that I've been working with in the last years. And I'm very happy to have here the colleagues from India. I'm sure you are enjoying our country, our university, and although we are in the anti-meridian, I hope that your jet lag is now that bad. Okay, well, today I'm going to talk about understanding disaster risk and disasters. Sometimes, very often actually, not only sometimes, we talk about disasters, hazards, risk in a similar way. I mean, we use them as a synonym, but there are different aspects that are related to these words that we really need to understand if we would like to contribute to issues, important issues such as disaster risk reduction. So the first, in this slide, we have a very important comment on a question about or wondering how, despite the scientific and technological progress that we have been doing around the world, disasters are still increasing, and therefore the consequences in terms of economic, social impact, and environmental impacts. So what is happening? Why we produce so much work and we have not been able really to translate that into reducing disasters? Let me see if I can find this thing. No. Can I move the slides with this? No. Yes? How come? With it? Yeah, this one. Ah, la de abajo. Ah, para allá. Okay, okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So the topics I'm going to consider for today's talk is precisely what you can see here. There are 5. The first one is related to disasters, a very short introduction, followed by important issues on the international agenda related to disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. And then I will spend some time in addressing some issues related to the understanding of disaster risk, to then talk about the research that we are doing from an integrated perspective to do disaster risk, to understand disaster risk and to address disaster risk, and finally with some concluding remarks. Okay, then let's start with the introductions about disasters. And we have here that if we look at any type of consequences of disasters, really the amount of losses is very, very big. For example, we have here that since 1992, that was the conference of Rio, the Earth Summit, we have 4.4 billion people affected, and economic damages in the order of $2 trillion US, and more than 1 million people have been killed. And before the disaster we had in the US due to Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it was quite common to think that disasters only took place in the so-called developing world. So, but then what happened was very interesting, because precisely in the US, we have here an amount of 560 billion US dollars in damages in the same period of time, but a big quantity of this amount of money was related to Hurricane Katrina. But also, we have very sad cases such as Haiti, the earthquake of 2010, that you remember in that earthquake, more than 200 people died. And the problem with Haiti is that they have very high levels of vulnerability and exposure. And even without the earthquake, the country was already a disaster. And then we move into China, one of the new powerful countries with losses of 2.5 billion of affected people. That is also a very important issue that we need to consider, the affected people. So the importance of disasters is related to human losses, injured people, displaced people, which also will become a very important issue with all these immigration patterns and problems we are facing all around the world, the adverse economic effects in terms of infrastructure, property damage, loss of property value, that is also very important, disruption of transportation, water supplies, etc., and the environmental impact, which also has a very strong component in terms of food availability. If we are talking about the consequences of timber, agriculture, cattle, fish stocks, and so on, we are going to have a very hard time also in terms of food availability. Okay, so I took only the hazard related to landslides, not only because I am working with landslides, because also the colleagues from India have a lot of problems with landslides. I had the opportunity to go to Darjeeling some time ago to see the landslides in the tea gardens, and all this area is very interesting. So what we can see here are the consequences of landslide disasters from 1900 to 2016. And we can see here that they were 730 events registered, and more than 67,000 people killed, plus more than 14 million people affected. This is related to a database, international database that is hosted in the University of Louvain in Belgium. And what we can see here is that the region that is most affected is precisely Asia. And we have here the amount of the event register that is more than half of them, 38% of the fatalities, and 60% of the total people affected. And of course, here in the Americas, we are not doing very good either, and we can see that is the next region with that kind of problems, with also these issues. But this database has a singularity. This database is only for events of high magnitude and low frequency. And what happened is that they do not take into account small and medium disasters that are more common on a yearly basis or even monthly basis. And we really don't have the full picture of the consequences of that because of that reason. So to compare what is the importance of the difference of these kind of events, I have used the work done by a colleague from, at this time he was at Durham University, now I think David is moved to Sheffield, somewhere else in the UK, but what he did was to document all the landslides that were associated to disasters from 2004 and 2010. And if we look at the same period of time in the database I showed you before, we have that only they have registered 130 landslides and 7,431 people killed. For the same period of time, what this database is showing is far away from those numbers. And what we have here is that people killed was in the order of 2,620 people, and the people affected was more than 32,000. So, and this is the very same for all hazards, not only for landslides. And what we can see here is that the documentation about landslides is not that good, and we cannot really rely on those databases because of that reason. So, common things about Mexico and India, many things, but one of the ones that I like most is precisely mountains. I love mountains, and all the wonderful sites you have in India are just really fantastic. And but the problem we have is that in those beautiful landscapes, we also have problems related to these issues: inaccessibility, fragility, isolation, backwardness, marginality, insecurity, harsh climates, unsafe conditions, underdevelopment or not development, and roach terrain. So these are very important issues if we want to deal with development, with everyday life in such regions. And those are important aspects or factors that we need to consider when studying or addressing disasters related to any kind of hazards. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some of the international agendas that are taking place around the globe, on which Mexico is taking part, that are related to disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. And the most important agenda is precisely the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So what I'm going to do is to show you the other agendas that are related to the Sendai framework for achieving this disaster risk management and reduction. Okay, so the first one, as I mentioned, was the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction that took place in Sendai in March in 2015. But also, there is an important conference that is not very well known, that is the International Conference on Financing for Development that took place in Ethiopia. And then the Sustainable Development Goals in New York, and finally the Framework Convention on Climate Change in Paris. These four agreements took place in 2015, all of them, and they are linked to each other. The first one, the Sendai Framework, has the objective of this, the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses of lives, livelihoods, and health, and the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, business, communities, and countries. Okay, they have now a guiding purpose, that is the multi-hazard management and disaster risk in development at all levels, as well as within and across all sectors, but taking into account the risk of small scale and large scale, frequent and infrequent, sudden and slow onset disasters caused by natural or man-made hazards, as well as related environmental, technological, and biological hazards and risk. So what they are saying here is that they need to take a multi-hazard approach, and they have to work among all sectors. And they have also to look at the different scales on which disasters take place, but also on which disasters are constructed. We need not only to look at the national level, what are the policy-making issues that are being addressed, but also what is happening with the communities, which are the places where disaster risk is really constructed. So the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is comprises the scope and purpose, one global outcome, one goal, 7 global targets, 4 priorities for action, and 13 guiding principles. We are not going to look at all of them, but we can see here the same factors that I just mentioned. But the important thing is that we are considering in this framework 4 levels, which are the local, the national, the regional, and the global. Most of the time, we have been looking at the global, regional, and in few cases at national. But the local level is a very important advance in this framework, in addition to the role of different stakeholders. That means that not only the governments, but the academia, the private sector, the public sector, and the population, the community, the individuals, in other words, everybody, is responsible for disaster risk reduction. All of us have to be involved in this issue of disaster risk reduction, so we have to be engaged, and we have to share responsibilities among all stakeholders. So the 4 priorities of this Sendai framework are these ones: understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, and enhancing preparedness and building back better. The second agenda that I mentioned that took place in Ethiopia was related to the financial issues, which are important because we can say that we want to do many things, but someone has to put a little bit of money at least, plus the governments, to really bring this to reality. And this agenda is a follow-up on the commitments that were related to the implementation of the Monterrey Consensus, another declaration that was also contributing to the financial support for the countries to improve to improve sustainability, different aspects of sustainability, and really to look at the way we can implement the post-2015 development agenda, and to reinvigorate and strengthening the financial for development to ensure that the actions that we are committed can be implemented and reviewed in a proper, inclusive, timely, and transparent way. Very often we have a different agendas that are nicely set up, but there is not really a proper way of assessing the programs of such agendas, and most importantly, how we implement that in the countries. Very often the countries report back to the United Nations Assembly and they say, oh, we are doing very well in disaster risk reduction, we have decreased the numbers of disasters and people affected, and so on and so on. But there is no way really to validate the information they provide. And very often the people in charge of these issues have no idea about what is really happening in the world, but they just, not in the world, in the country, but they just report back because they have to do it, not because they have really implemented the actions, and that is very important. So the idea of this framework is to end poverty and hunger, to protect the environment, and also they recognize the significance of aligning topics such as climate change, humanitarian stuff, and development. So they also have in mind that we need to share these agendas to align those goals of the agendas so that we can do it in a better way. Okay, now, well, this is a more familiar agenda for you. I'm sure that is the Sustainable Development Goals. That the aim is ending poverty and hunger, protecting the planet from degradation, ensuring that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives, at the same time that development is in equilibrium with nature, fostering peaceful, just and inclusive societies, and enhancing global partnerships for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Well, this is a lot of dreaming, of course. We really hope that it could be some advance. Well, I'm sure this is not going to be unfortunately undertaken as it is written there, but important is to have some advance on development and to understanding how the damage, the deterioration that we produce in the planet is affecting different aspects, and being, of course, disaster risk one of them. So the SDGs are here, are all of these, and the important thing is that they are looking into the sustainable development based on people, planet, prosperity, partnership, and peace. Okay, And then we move into the final agreement, which is the Paris on climate change, that also this important one took place in 2015, although there have been a lot of meetings after this one, but this was the main one at the time that the Sendai framework was established. Well, they want to reduce the emissions to keep global temperature rise well below 2 degrees. Now that has been changed a little bit, to limit the increase of to 1.5 centigrades under a stronger system of transparency and accountability for measuring progress. But what is true is that although this is a all countries policy that includes the support actions of non-party stakeholders, business, investors, states, and so on, is very hard really to achieve that, because the governments are the ones that have the last word, and we have our neighbors at the north, and we have also China, although it's improving a little bit, that are issues that are very important when these agendas are trying to move forward. So in this agenda, we have 29 articles dealing with mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, technology, development and transfer, capacity building and transparency of action, global stock take and support. So mainly these 4 agendas are related to the same goal, but from different windows. The important thing is to have a relationship with the environment that is in equilibrium, that would allow us to move forward as a society. And for example, if we look at what is happening in the mountains, we are very much concerned about the disappearance of glaciers, which are very sensitive and unique ecosystems that are so much degraded, and how also this melting of the glaciers and the permafrost in other places are creating different hazards in those areas, but also how the different patterns of climate are also having incidence on the precipitation patterns that are related, for example, to landslides, to flooding, and also hurricanes and so on. So all of this is related to hazards and vulnerability that make really the question of risk. So what we are looking from the academia in collaboration with other sectors is precisely to have a coherence among these agendas, because if we do not work together, it's going to be even more difficult really to achieve the goals. They are also goals that are, well, not impossible to reach, but very difficult to reach because of the economic interests of different groups, of different nations. But the idea is to work from the academia to push this agenda and to push the coherence of this agenda. So what we need to do is really to make sure, from our perspective, from the work we do, is that the scientific research must be useful, usable, and most importantly, used. We have been somehow how can I say? In some cases, people wonder where the research that is done in the universities is going. And I cannot say the exact amount, but very often, many important research that we do in different disciplines is just in the papers. And we need to move into practice and policy making. And that is not an easy step. It's not only saying, okay, we want to contribute to policy making. No, no, no. It's a very, very big issue, but we need to make sure that we need to really have our research being used by the proper stakeholders and to be understood. Now we move into the third part of the talk, that is understanding disaster risk. I like this part very much. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. So we have here again the 4 priorities of Sendai framework, as you remember, and we are going to be looking at understanding disaster risk. Okay, we have a problem here. very often we talk about, well, no, not me, but people do, because I don't do that. People talk about natural disasters. And when I do my teaching, I fail all those students that talk about natural disasters, even in class, not only in the exam. But I explain them why we should not talk about natural disasters. Some people say, oh, come on, don't bother. Yes, I really get upset about that, because it has very important consequences. It's very common that the governments and the mass media talk about natural disasters because it's very convenient for them. Well, I am the president, I am the governor, I am the whatever you want, authority, but because the disaster is natural, there is no blame of me. I was doing my work in the best possible way, and just this very bad hurricane came and destroyed all my community. Or the earthquake, was so big. Oh, that earthquake with magnitude almost 9. No, that was terrible. And that is replicated with all hazards. But we need to understand really why disaster risk is taking place and why we cannot call them like that. So there is a public misunderstanding of disasters as natural, reflected in the existing research. If we have a look at the papers published, even this year, not 10 years ago, even this year, I can bet you that you will find plenty of papers talking about natural disasters. Well, I have a confession to make. 2 weeks ago, I was in Geneva in the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the new lady, a Japanese lady who is in charge of the Office of Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva, there was a ceremony for an award, the Sasakawa Prize, and she, who is the head of the office, was talking about natural disasters, right? Maybe I can forgive her because she's Japanese. And really they have another cultural conceptions about disasters and all that. But when we talk about natural disasters, we really are supporting how the extreme natural events are really controlling our societies. So here, although we acknowledge the significance, the very important contribution that natural sciences are doing to the understanding of the dynamic of the hazards, we also need to have a look at the social science and to see how we are understanding vulnerability and exposure. And very often they said, okay, it is because of the building codes or the design of the building that they collapse. Yes, they have to do something related to that. But in addition to that, and in Mexico after the earthquakes of 2017, everybody knows one of the main issues related to that disaster was corruption. Right? So there are different issues related to vulnerability that need to be put forward to really understand what these things are happening. So somehow a very important part of the research we do is related to the science of extreme events, which are important, among them climate change. But there is a gap left by the lack of attention to root causes of disasters, to factors inducing vulnerability. That means all the social decision-making that has been taking place for ages, not only in the last few years, but for long periods of times, that how societies have been developing so far. So the idea is, so disasters are taking place, we are doing a lot of research, but why this is happening? Well, perhaps not many of you are familiar with this model. This is a model that is called the progression of vulnerability that was made in 1994. Everybody that has been working in disaster risk reduction knows this model because it's related to how the different aspects of society give rise to vulnerability. So, for example, in here they talk about root causes that is related to resources, to ideology, to political systems, economic systems, and so on, and the dynamic pressures that are more related to economic systems of how decisions are making at local level, international level, in terms of, for example, urbanization, deforestation, population change, and so on, that are affecting our societies and give rise to unsafe conditions that are more, for example, related to the building codes that are not properly implemented. And all these factors are related to vulnerability. And when they are linked to different kind of hazards, they produce this disaster risk equation. What we have here is that the previous agenda for disaster risk reduction, that was the HYOGO framework, had 5 priorities. The current one has 4. This one had 5. And the 4th one was reducing the underlying risk factors. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And not only that didn't happen, they removed this priority from the Sendai framework. And it is more easy now for people only to look at the warning systems and the technology, instead of trying to change what are the conditions in society that are producing the risk of disasters. And we, in geography, for example, are very much concerned with that issue. And what we have here is precisely that kind of relationship. We have here, this is disaster risk. In here we have exposure, here in this one, exposure and vulnerability and hazards. So when we have different hazards that could be natural, socio-natural, or technological hazards that are combined with the different aspects of vulnerability, and they are met actually in a specific location, in a place, this is the exposure. The exposure is the location on which societies that are susceptible to be affected by the hazards is taking place. Okay, so what I needed to say in the previous slide that I forgot, oops, sorry, is that, no, I think I put them in the wrong way. I'm going to start, sorry about that, I will go back to the other slide. If we have a look at this slide, maybe we can understand why disasters are not natural. In here, just because of practical issues, I am dividing the planet into 2 systems, but that cannot be done. That is impossible. We have a single system, okay? So on one hand, we have what I am calling here the natural system. So with all this dynamic of the interior of the Earth, the atmosphere, and all those lithospheres and biosphere and so on, just by nature, even before human beings were here, and I'm not going to repeat what Lopez Obrador had said about all this timing of the Earth, okay? In a natural way, we have different phenomena. And here in geology and in geophysics, you study quite a lot from the physical perspective, from the dynamic perspective, volcanoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on, landslides. So those phenomena become hazards when they can affect people. If they cannot affect people, either directly or indirectly, they are just phenomena, okay? So we can have the natural system, we have the phenomena, and when they can affect people, they become hazards. They could be natural if we are talking about earthquakes, I mean natural earthquakes, not the induced ones, the volcanoes. But we also have socio-natural hazards that are related to changes that we have made to the surface of the Earth. For example, landslides and floods are not natural, they are socio-natural. They have a physical component, but also they have a social component because we are the ones living in the floodplains, or we are the ones somehow building on the slopes or building terraces or routes or whatever, right? So that's why they are called socio-natural. But also we have the technological or the anthropogenic that are 100% anthropogenic. So we have these hazards, regardless of the surname of the hazards. And also, we have here something much more complicated, that is the human systems. So as societies, as cultures, we have different beliefs. We have different conditions of living standards, socioeconomic, cultural, and most importantly, we have a lot of issues related to institutions. How they do the decision making. How, for example, in Mexico, the national civil protection systems can really decide who is in charge of the units that are related to reducing risk. So those decisions of the governments are also part of the society, but they are also part of the vulnerability. So when we have this combination of both, although it's the same planet, of course, the hazards and the vulnerability, we talk about societies that are exposed to those hazards. In other words, where are they sitting, where they are living, where they are constructed, where they are built. And with those, we talk about disaster risk. Disaster risk is a condition, is something that is potential. So we are in the risk of having a disaster. That doesn't mean that we live in a disaster, although these days in Mexico, I think we live in a disaster, but that's another issue. So we have this propensity to be affected by the hazards, and because we have very high or different levels of vulnerability, maybe we don't have enough education, maybe our decision makers are not doing the proper ways, maybe we don't have enough resources to live in good housing conditions far away from the rivers and so on. We are on the spot. We are likely to face a disaster. So that is disaster risk. When the disaster takes place, that always is triggered, the disaster is triggered by a hazard. That's why there is also a confusion. They say, okay, the disaster was because of the earthquake. No, the disaster was triggered by the earthquake, but the conditions of vulnerability were already in place in the society. If the society was not vulnerable, we wouldn't have a disaster, right? So we have conditions of disaster. That is disaster risk. And when that is materialized, crystallized, when that takes place, and triggered mainly by a hazard, regardless of the hazard, so we are in the disaster. And that is the reason why disasters cannot be natural, because we have always the vulnerability component. So I'm going to go back to the other slide, if I can. Can you help? Thank you. Just two back. Back. Okay. This is a methodology we have been working for a few years now that is called forensic investigations of disasters. Okay, thank you. Wonderful. That's very kind of you. Okay. Yeah, that's much better. Okay. So in here, what we have is the same story that I have been telling you, but we work on disaster risk research from this perspective. Very often, many of us work only on the hazard. But what we look at through this forensic investigation of disasters is to see all these aspects. And we don't go and see the bodies that are left because of the disasters. Although the word is forensic, is really to understand what is behind before the disaster takes place. So what we have here is the societies. Those societies have different socioeconomic political systems. I'm going to give you just the example of Mexico City earthquakes to understand these concepts. For example, before the Spaniards came to Mexico, as you know, we live on a series of lakes, and everybody was happy, and there was a very good relation or equilibrium among the societies and even the economic activities with the environment, with the planet. Okay, so the Spanish came and they started to drain the lakes and do the building the cathedrals and doing all the things that we know. So if we look at the case of the earthquakes, what we can see is that if the root causes of the disasters triggered by the earthquakes are related back in history to this period of times. So one of the root causes was the drainage of the lake, the change of those conditions, okay? So that was very important. But also how the institutions have been developed through time. And they have, for example, allowed the growth of the city, although we know that since many, many years ago, we have been having earthquakes, that is very well documented. They never think or never consider that we needed to have a city with planning, a city that was more related to the natural conditions we have. So those decisions have been inducing somehow the development of risk drivers. For example, urbanization, lack of planning, deforestation, even poverty, because the housing conditions of different areas are very bad. All those issues related to that are called risk drivers give rise to conditions of vulnerability and exposure. But also institutions, as we said, for example, related to corruption, they allow to build the buildings in areas that cannot be done, or even worse, with materials that are not good enough, or they don't respect the codes, or even maybe we don't know if the code is good for all the areas of the city, or not only Mexico City, because also we always think about Mexico City as the country. But what happened with the building codes in other areas? Many provinces of Mexico lack of building codes according to the conditions of soil. So all those factors are related to immediate or critical causes. So we build the housing, the schools, and so on in areas where we shouldn't have, with the methods that we shouldn't allow, or even maybe we didn't allow them to build, but they were built. So that is also a failure. That is also a part of vulnerability. And then the last bit of this process is precisely the hazard or the event. So that the earthquake arrives, and what happens is that the earthquake triggers the disaster, right? But we have not only to look at the earthquake. If we understand the earthquakes, we are not going to reduce disaster risk per se. It is important part of the equation, but we also need to look at all these other aspects if really want to reduce disaster. Okay, thank you. So we saw that, and then integrated. Okay, now we're going to go to see integrated research on disaster risk. Very often, we think, like when we ask the students to do a report, what they do is they divide the work. Okay, you do this, that, and then there is always the nerd or the committed one that brings everything together, but very often they don't have an idea of how that is related. So in research, sometimes, I'm not going to say that all the time, but sometimes also happens the same, because the volcanologists do his work, the geologists do their work, the geographers do their work, and so on. But not commonly, they sit down and think how they can address the problem and then contribute from its particular discipline. So we know that most of the investigations concerning hazards and their associated vulnerability have been dominated by monodisciplinary approaches or perspectives. But we have to recognize that only recently, also multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity research has also contributed to the understanding of disaster risk. But this is rather new, but it's important. We have here different kind of disaster risk, which is intensive, related to large concentration of people and economic activities, populated areas, and the impact of this disaster is very, very big and can involve high mortality and losses. Okay, that's good. and these are mainly high magnitude, next one, low frequency events. On the contrary, what we are thinking is that we need to have a unification of science and policy making around practice, which is crucial for really effective and efficient implementation strategies of disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. So we have somehow in different groups that are working on disaster risk reduction and management to try to inform public policy and science and how the decision-making processes should be based on scientific evidence. Next one, please. Now you realize, and I have realized that the previous slide was misplaced somewhere there. And this one says that extreme events are not only where there is the greatest physical energy that is discharged, but rather where there is more associated and damage loss related to vulnerability. So what we are saying is that although it is very important to have the understanding of the physical events, we also need to look at the vulnerability and exposure issues to provide input to the decision makers. And to do that, it is important to have different strategies according to these colleagues so that we can really engage on this issue, sharing knowledge for action, using a multidisciplinary approach to research, and building systems resilience through local, national, regional, and international partnerships. So based on all these ideas of different people and also in the reality, what we are sure is that we need to improve the scientific knowledge, but also we need to improve the education so that we can have societies that are less and less vulnerable, and to build links between science and policy making, and building also capacity through education so that people is aware of how disaster risk is constructed, not only in terms of the hazard, but understanding all the factors that play a role in the social construction of risk. So in this part of the concluding remarks, I will take forward what we have been saying in the previous part, and that is integrated science and transdisciplinarity. We were talking before about interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. But now that is even more difficult because we need to move into something that is called integrated science or transdisciplinarity. This is integrated research on disaster risk, on which we have really to look at all these aspects, and I'm sure that many more are missing. These are the only examples. Please forgive me if your discipline is not there. But also, the challenge really is not only to work with the academia, but also to work with the societies and the public and the policymakers. Working with the society is not easy, but believe me, it's easier than working with the policymakers. We have been working with the chambers of deputies because they are making a new law on integrated disaster risk and on civil protection, and it's really a nightmare. So, but the challenge is to start working since the very beginning, not to do the research and then at the end of it, when we have done the work, okay, I am going to invite you just to the conference so that people know that you are part, among brackets. I mean, because it's not really that they are taking part, it's just that they are invited just for the last bit of the process. And what we need to do is to involve all the stakeholders from the very beginning, and that is very, very difficult to make. So we have been working with this guy, very, very, very clever guy. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And well, we are in Mexico. What else can we say? Okay, next one. We have been working with different colleagues from different disciplines and from different countries, and we have made a call so that we have a new direction on the research that can be really integrated and transdisciplinary research, so that all stakeholders can be engaged in the co-production of knowledge, what I was saying before. Not only we produce the knowledge and then we tell them, okay, come here to the party and that's it. No, we need to produce the knowledge all together. And we did this call in 2015 about the need of having a coherent science-based assessment process for disaster risk reduction, so that we can provide sound knowledge to inform decision-making and to assist governments worldwide in setting policies and goals, and to identify research gaps. So it is something like having an IPCC, but for disaster risk reduction, because it is important to move to have this high-level transdisciplinary body of international experts on disaster risk reduction that can be linked not only to national government, but to international organizations that are related to this topic of disaster risk, so that we can have also inputs from various sectors, including the civil society, to influence people awareness and mostly decision-making of authorities. Okay, so in here what I would like to represent is that we have his space and time, and we need to recognize that human agency, whatever we do as human beings, whatever we have been doing for many years, is the primary factor, not only for climate change, but also for building risk and disasters. So if we need to address disaster risk issues, we really need to look and change what we have been doing and the activities we have been performed as human beings. But there are different obstacles. I'm not going to talk about all those obstacles, but for the implementation of disaster risk reduction and management, not only in Mexico City, but I'm sure in India, our colleagues are agreeing about all these issues. I'm sure we share all these problems very much. One thing that is very important is trust. If there is no trust about communities, about not only civil society, but among the academia and the policy makers and the practitioners, we are not going to move anywhere. And ethics should be always the base of all type of collaborative work we do in any discipline, in any matter, in any aspect, but particularly in disaster risk and disaster risk reduction. And with this, I finish. Thank you very much. Question later, right?
Thank you, Irasema. The idea is